Hello and thanks for the click. This is the build video for the Tamiya Dynahead 6x6. If you'd like to see the unboxing for this kit, you'll find a link to that in the description. Now, unlike the last build video I did where I just ran the camera from start to finish, for this one I'm just going to break out the camera when it's time to show off a completed assembly or an interesting part, or to explain how something works or goes together. And while that will make for a shorter video, it should also make for one that's going to be more informative and hopefully more entertaining. But we'll get right to it. This is the manual for the truck. Does not show a body because presumably they'll have other bodies on this platform. And as we discussed with the unboxing video, this is the first G6-01 to get this TR designation, which means it's got portal axles. And the build starts off like the other G6-01 kits with a chassis. And the chassis for this truck also doubles as the gearbox. It's basically just one big gearbox. And things start off with the installation of the suspension arms and the upper camber links for the middle set of wheels on the 6x6, and then we get into assembly of the differentials. And to me, it does something interesting here. They give you this kind of putty-like material that they instruct you to cut off a 5mm section of, and then you roll that into a ball and you put it inside the differential in lieu of grease, which effectively locks it. You can still operate the differential once that's in there, but it's a good 80 or 90% locked up. And that's because unlike the Kong Head and the King Yellow, which are kind of, go fast, bash around trucks, this one, particularly with its portal axles, really has a super low gear ratio overall, and that makes it more of a trail vehicle designed for extreme terrain, super high torque as opposed to higher speed and RPM. So you definitely don't want to have the differential unload to the wheel with the least traction or no traction if you have a wheel in the air. So this putty in the differential setup is going to help things out in that department. There are 3 differentials, front, center, and rear, for the 3 sets of tires. You can see how the gears drop in there. Some of these are plain gears. You also have some compound gears. And as you can see, it's just full from top to bottom. And when you finish these steps, this is what you wind up with. Here's your assembled chassis / transmission. You can see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 gears in there. Even more if you want to count these compound gears where it's 2 gears on 1 shaft. So you got front, center, and rear differentials, and I've left this rear differential open so you can see that putty in there. Get this to focus up. So there's no grease at all for those 3 gear internals, just this ball of putty material that goes in between the spider gears. And it's really thick and tacky stuff. Once you start operating the gears, that stuff will just wrap around the spider gears and effectively lock it up. I'd say it's 80 or 90% locked up once you've got that all around the gears. But to me, it does not instruct you to spread that around. They just tell you to make that little ball there and drop it in. So that's what I did, and we'll see how that works out. So I'll go ahead and button this one back up, and then we're going to move on to the portal axle assembly. Oops, I have to put the output gear in. But the portals will be brand new parts for Tamiya, so it'll be interesting to try those out. Much of the G6-01 and the Dynahead in particular is comprised of existing Tamiya parts. For example, these 3 gear internals are parts you've seen on countless Tamiya models if you're a Tamiya builder. And there are also parts from the Wild Willie 2000 and the other kits on that chassis. I believe that's the WR02. But the suspension arms come from there. There's actually a complete set of chassis rails for that model in the box for this truck, which you won't need, but put them aside in case you build a Wild Willie 2000 or one of Tamiya's other wheelie vehicles, and you'll have spare parts ready to go. We'll take a little peek at what's ahead. So coming up, we'll install the motor, and the motor is interesting because the pinion actually meshes with these 2 gears simultaneously. Right now, this front gear train and the rear gear train, those aren't connected at all. It's only when the motor goes in that these 2 gears are going to be meshing together with the pinion. And the truck does have preset gear mesh. This is where the motor's going to go right here. And you have 2 sets of screw holes there. One is for an 18-tooth pinion, which is the included size. There's also a 20-tooth pinion that will fit the vehicle. And then once we put the motor in and the suspension arms on, we're gonna dig into these portal axles. That should be pretty cool. So I'm gonna get to it, and I'll see you in a few minutes when I've got something to show you. Okay, let's talk some portals. Here are the assembly instructions in the manual that show how those go together. And here is one I've assembled and I've left dry so you can see how everything fits in there. I'll let the camera focus. And these are great looking parts. Those gears are just perfect. And I've got a dog bone here so I can get in there. There's a drive cup behind there. And turn these. Now I don't have the cover on yet, so this is just a little bit notchy because the axles you see there would be supported by bearings once I get the cover on. But the parts mesh really nicely and they're very well made. Here's the cover. It's a mixture of bearings and oil-like bushings in there. I'll get some light on there for you. And the big bearing is just one of the plain nylon bushings. So again, if you want to upgrade to ball bearings, definitely easier to do it as you build than to go back later. Actually, I'll get that bushing. Again, I'm going to go back and grease this, but I just wanted you to see it all together. And this is one of the front portals because it has these tabs for the steering linkages. But that's pretty cool. The front and rears are identical internally, but the rears have this piece. You can see it's got this tang where the camber link will attach because these don't need to steer. So the center and rear sets of wheels will get these, and the front suspension will get these steerable parts. You can see the hole for the kingpin there. Kingpin here, kingpin there. And that will let that steer. And there are our portal axles. I gotta say, those look pretty good. All right, onward. The front portals get this extra extension for steering, and that is a separate part on the tree. And this just slots in like that. Then we've got a 2.6 by 14 millimeter screw that goes in there, and a nut on the bottom. And the included classic Tamiya 4-way wrench will be used to tighten that up. And we also need a ball stud to go in there, and that goes in from the bottom. Same thing, Tamiya wrench will get it done. Always try to make sure I get these things started straight. And now we've got our front portals ready to go in with steering arms attached. Here's one of the portals with the C-hub attached for steering. You can see how it's slotted in the back there so that the dog bone can get in there. And these are installed with 4mm king pins. And to me it says you should lubricate these, but I do not, because the grease is just going to attract dirt and dust. And these are only turning a few degrees. They aren't, rotating with RPM and speed where you're going to need to have lube on there. And it's a smooth steel shoulder on a smooth plastic bore, so I'm not really worried that that's gonna have any trouble without grease on there. And I think the grease is just gonna attract dirt and try to do more harm than good. All right, so let's get the rest of the front suspension together and we'll put these guys on. Okay, the front portals are on there, and you can see how the dog bone leaves the chassis and goes into the portal, and how much lower the stub axle exits from the portal. And per the box art, there's a 15 millimeter drop from where the dog bone is to where the portal stub axle actually exits. That's a pretty significant boost in ground clearance. And that's what makes this a G6-01TR instead of just a G6-01. The Kong Head and King Yellow don't have these portal axles. So we're moving right along here, and we'll keep it going. We'll check back in with the next step. Okay, this is starting to look like a truck. All of these suspension parts are installed. As you can see, the motor is actually well ahead of the center of the chassis. We've got our steerable portals up front. These, of course, are fixed in the center and rear, but there is a rear steer option for this truck if you want to go that route. Suspension moves nice and freely. It's dog bones all around, which is fine. Again, this is more of a sport vehicle for playing around and having fun. Not worried that there aren't universal joints in there or a full set of ball bearings. This is just going to be a fun truck for rolling over some hopefully very challenging terrain. I expect this will be a pretty capable vehicle with 6 tires on the ground after all, and plenty of ground clearance with those portal axles. Next, we're going to do the friction shocks. No oil in these. Here's how they go together. There's a rubber tube that you cut to length, and the friction of this screw head passing through that rubber tube is what creates the damping effect, which is pretty minimal once you grease the tube and get everything assembled. But for this truck though, given that it's operating at low speed and it does not have tons and tons of suspension travel, I don't think it's going to really pogo around that much. I think it'll be fine. I mean, but believe me, I would rather see some nice oil-filled shocks there. To me, is CVA plastic body shocks are very nice and operate very smoothly. But hey, that's what hop-ups and upgrades are for. These will work just fine and get the truck rolling with no trouble at all. I've built plenty of these shocks before, and they work. I mean, they provide suspension. Oil shocks are always more interesting and more realistic, but friction, it's going to work. Okay, let's go ahead and build one of these shocks here. I've got a shock body, and I need a shock shaft, and this is going to pass right through. And then we've got the rod end. And the shaft actually has a Phillips head on there. It's just a big screw. So we'll tighten that up. And Tamiya calls for 20 millimeters of exposed shock shaft. And ordinarily I would do this with a set of calipers, but these friction shocks, it's not really all about precision. Not building a race car here. So tape measure style is perfectly fine for these. Next, I've got this rubber tube that's going to go in there. And per the manual, these sections are cut to a length of 12 millimeters. And these get greased. Then the cap goes on. And that is secured by a screw. I didn't nip this one quite cleanly enough, so I'm going to go ahead and clean up that cut there. Then we've got a spring and a spring perch, and that is our friction shock. As you can see, there's not a lot of travel there because it's not a very long travel suspension system, but that will do the job. And now I just need to build 5 more of these. If you're wondering about these big fat springs, these are actually for the front bumper. The shock springs are much smaller gauge. But that is for a later step. And the shocks are installed. And with that, we are getting in the home stretch. We're going to have to install the steering servo, put the strap on the battery tray there. Battery, of course, goes up top here. Put the wheels and tires on, get the electronics installed, and then we're going to have a Dynahead 6x6 once we paint and decal the body, that is. All right, let's keep it going. Okay, it's time to install the servo for the Dynahead, and for that I'm going to use this EcoPower or EcoPower WP120T waterproof servo. This is rated for 337 ounce-inches of torque at 6 volts or 407 ounce-inches at 7.4 volts, so a lot of servo here. This comes from A-Main Hobbies, by the way. And as usual for a Tamiya kit, they give you a few different options for the insert that goes into the servo horn, which looks like this. I got the ball stud on there. And this is their conventional spring type servo saver. You've got this plastic spring that goes on there, and that's going to flex to provide the servo saving action. But what we need to figure out is what the spline count is on the servo. We need to know how many lines, ribs, teeth, or splines, to use the correct term, are on this output shaft. And sometimes that's a spec that is right on the container, and sometimes it is not. And this one says output shaft 25T, so we're ready to go there. And that means we are going to need the insert, which is marked typically on a Tamiya model, Futaba. We'll see if this will focus up. But this one says Futaba. This one says Sanwa ACOMS, and that should be a 23 tooth or 23 spline. But that's the one we need right there. It's the Futaba one. And now we can get our servo installed. And ordinarily I would want to power up the servo and get it centered on this model because the servo is very easy to access once it's installed. I'm not that worried about getting it perfectly centered before I install it. But what I will do is just cycle the servo from end to end on its range to roughly find the center point. Okay, so that's there. That's there, so centered is going to be right about here. And per the manual, the servo saver is installed like so. We're ready to install the steering bell crank, and that is bell crank singular because there's only one in the truck. This will go to the servo, and these two linkages will go to the steering hubs. And the chassis actually has two locations for a steering bell crank. You've got this window up front, and that's the one we're going to use, of course, so we can have front wheel steering. But there's also an opening in the rear of the chassis, so you can have four-wheel steering. The bell crank will go right there. So we've got to feed this in. And then once we get this bell crank lined up with the posts, there's a pin that will drop in to provide the pivot. And we'll push that all the way down. And then a screw goes in to capture that. You can see how that screw will cross right over the opening for the pin to capture that in place. And with that, our bell crank is installed, which means we can move along to installing the servo. I've got the servo in, and you can see it's this kind of a outrigger setup where it hangs off the side of the chassis. And here's your linkage, and we have steering action. Now, one thing worth pointing out is the way the servo is attached. The screws are inside the battery tray here, which means your screwdriver needs to pass through the chassis. And Tamiya thoughtfully provides holes for that purpose, so that you can get your screwdriver across that tray and tighten the screws up. But you have to make sure that your screwdriver does not have too thick of a shank. This is a Harbor Freight screwdriver, which I got because my main screwdriver, this very high quality Vessel #2 with serrated tip, which gives it extra hold. Really nice screwdriver. It's just too fat. It just won't get into that hole there, so you can't get the screws tightened. And if we measure these shafts, which would be helpful so you can pick out the right screwdriver, we find that the vessel driver has a shaft diameter of 6.3 millimeters, whereas this Harbor Freight screwdriver has a 6 millimeter shaft. So make sure your screwdriver has a 6 millimeter or smaller shaft, and get a good number too. And I gotta say, this Pittsburgh one from Harbor Freight, which I think was like $1.50, has turned out to be a surprisingly pretty good screwdriver. And it does have a coated tip, which is really essentially one of a nice coated tip these days. And it's pretty well ground. So not bad, Harbor Freight. And let's keep this build going. We are in the home stretch, and that means we're putting body posts on. Exciting, I know. One thing though, if you're building the Dynahead, skip this step because the instructions do not show the correct body post configuration for the Dynahead, since this is a, I don't want to say generic, but a fits-all manual for the G6-01TR platform. What you want is the additional sheet that's in the box that shows how the Dynahead body posts are installed. And I'll skip showing you all these screws going in because it's just body posts. But if you're building one of these kits, make sure you get the correct body post setup. And that's not unusual for Tamiya, that there will be a separate instruction sheet for the body that might show a different body post configuration than what's in the main kit manual. So check that when you build your Tamiya model. But let's get this thing wrapped up. Alrighty, so it's time to mount the wheels and tires on the Dynahead. And something I did not notice when I did the original unboxing is that the wheels are directional. If you look at the spoke pattern, these appear to be designed to rotate counterclockwise, whereas this is a mirror image and meant to rotate clockwise. Now, it doesn't really matter which side of the truck you put these on. The truck's going to work just fine whether the wheels are backwards or not. But for me, I'm going to put these guys on the left side of the truck, and I'll make sure I put these on the right side of the truck just so the styling works out. If a wheel is directional, it bugs me when they appear to be backwards. And that definitely applies to full-size cars as well. Something else I'm thinking about is the profile of the wheel. If you look at the wheel shape here, this is the front of the rim, and you can see it's got this bevel on it, whereas the back of the rim is just perfectly flat. And when the tire is mounted, on the rear here, you can see there's a little bit of a lip where the tire goes past the edge of the rim. But on the front, the face of the wheel is right there flush with the sidewall. So there's really no protection for that wheel when you scrape against rocks or obstacles. So I'm afraid that's going to get chewed up, which won't hurt anything in terms of the truck operating and being able to do its thing on the trail, but it is a bummer to chew up these really nice looking wheels. But that's life. That's how it goes with RC, so we'll keep an eye on that. Something else I'm thinking about is gluing the tires, because the manual does not call for the tires to be glued. It's not uncommon for Tamiya tires to be glue-less, especially when they're the very hard plasticky material that Tamiya uses on some kits. These are not that firm. It's still, kind of rubbery, and it's got some grip on the wheel. It doesn't just, turn easily on the rim. But we'll see what happens on the trail, and I can always glue them later. And if I do mount a tire backwards, because these are directional, you can see the V-tread. If they're not glued, I can easily fix that goof, because that's the kind of goof I would make. But I will do my best to get these correct, make sure we have the tires mounted in the proper direction relative to the wheel design and to the side of the truck they're going onto. And I'll be back in a bit, and we should have a rolling chassis. This isn't really a cool thing, but it was something I wanted to show you in case you build a Dynahead, and I don't want you to miss this part of the assembly step. When you put the wheel hexes on, which normally involves putting a pin in there and then you put the hex on and you're done, Tamiya calls for these spacers to go behind the hex. And these are on the same tree as the portal housings. But that goes on first, then your cross pin goes in, and then your wheel hex goes on. And there are two different height wheel hexes. This is the taller one, E10. You want to make sure you use those and not the shallower version. There we go. Ready for the wheel. The Dynahead 6x6 rolling chassis is complete, but before I show it off, I wanted to point out that I did make a mistake in the unboxing video, and I may have mentioned in this video too, where I say that the parts to make the truck four-wheel steering are available separately. They are in fact included with the kit. You get the correct portal covers with these little tabs on them, and that's what will make these into steerable parts. It's got a little extension on there for the steering arms, or for the steering linkage. You get the suspension arms that are designed to fit with C-hubs. And you get the required kingpin screws. The linkage setup for the rear steering, which is a little different than the front one. And you get the camber links that go with the shorter suspension arms that the steering setup uses. So all that stuff is in the box. And as for the vehicle itself, we'll zoom out here. And here is the Dynahead 6x6. This is a pretty neat looking chassis. I like the way the servo hangs off the side there. It looks nice, especially with that bright white Echo Power logo. Have not installed the speed control yet, but I do have a receiver in there. And as you can see, there's more of a gap between the front pair of wheels and the 4 rear sets, as opposed to them all being equally spaced along the wheelbase of the truck. And although it's got basically pogo sticks for shocks, it's not super bouncy. I mean, it recoils pretty harshly, but after one bounce back, it's fine. This has the spring-loaded bumper. I don't know if you can see that compressing, but the springs are really stiff. And that will flex if you bump into something. Now what that does for approach angle we'll see, but that bumper can always come off, and I suspect it might. Now at this point I usually stall out, and it takes me like 2 weeks to get around to painting the body, but I'm trying to get this one into RC car action as quick as I can, so we'll blast out a coat of silver and put the decals on that Tamiya body. I don't think I can place it until I get the thing trimmed out, but let me grab the body real quick and we'll take a look. I can see the antenna is going to be in the way, so let me pull this off. And it's going to look approximately like that. So there's the Dynahead 6x6, a speed control and a paint job away from being done. We will do it up just like the box art. And this should be lots of fun out on the trail. Definitely lots of fun to build. Again, if you've never built an RC car before, I definitely recommend starting with a Tamiya kit. They are terrific. Lots of fun to put together and easy to put together, and pretty rewarding experience. And even the beginner ones, if you're an experienced kit builder, they're still fun. And even the more advanced Tamiya models still go together pretty easily. So anywhere you want to start with a Tamiya kit, you'll probably have a good time building one. So that's our Tamiya Dynahead 6x6 G6-01TR rolling chassis build. Hope you enjoyed watching as I built along. I certainly enjoyed building it. And as soon as this one's done, we'll get some shots of it in action out on the trail. And thank you for watching.